in the state of Nebraska, disabilities living in it, according to the disability compendium. And one of the speakers after me will give you a copy of that. We are the largest minority group in the United States with approximately 54 million people, but we are the least considered group when the legislation is passed. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. It was described as landmark civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. In 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court released a decision saying people with disabilities needed to live in the least restricted environment, and states had to develop a plan. Fast forward to today, Nebraska and the legislature did finally require the departments to develop an homestead plan. However, DHHS is dragging their feet in getting it done. We still are seeing many instances where people with disabilities, you can't even cross the county line if you're a person with a disability. Our governor, our previous governor, when they implemented Test Nebraska, and we pointed out it's inaccessible, he said, well, it's for real people. In my mind, I mean, I'm not a real person. I find that kind of offensive. Also, the governorship never supported the homestead plan. And because I was, from a previous governor, I was told we do not need an homestead plan because it would admit we're doing something wrong. I have some problems with that type of mind. And I hope you will move this bill out of committee.
Okay, very,
And it will get passed. And does anybody have any questions?
yes, very good. Any questions for the testifier? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony here today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next proponent testifier. And how many testifiers do we have on LB 39 today? Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the executive board. I would first like to thank Carol for bringing this important issue forward. My name is Deanna Henke, DeannaHenke. I'm a person who lives in Lincoln with a disability, and I am here today to testify in favor of LB 39. When bills are voted on in our unicameral, historically, people with disabilities are completely ignored. The few times that we have had senators who have looked into what impact it would have on us, they have asked able-bodied people. The people that know the impact this would have on us are those of us who live the experience, those of us who have a disability and live with it every day that know the impact it would have. The impact it would have on our lives is never considered. People with disabilities make up 25% of the population. By not considering us, you are alienating 1/4 of your constituents. Some bills, such as those in voting, education, transportation, and housing, can have a very negative impact on us. For instance, I have been actively searching for wheelchair accessible, affordable housing for over 5 years. The only accessible, affordable places in Lincoln have years-long waiting lists or cost more than an entire disability check per month. Because of this, I cannot use my wheelchair at home and have had several bad falls, some of which ended me up in the emergency room. Yet accessibility and affordability were not discussed when housing bills were considered. When people from the disabled community testified concerning the seclusion and restraint bill, we were told that this bill affected normal children, not children with disabilities. I wrote to the senator that called the children without disabilities as the only normal children, and told him that this was offensive and told him what language would be acceptable and asked him to please contact me back. And of course, I never heard from him. We're not asking for special rights. We're only asking to be seen, heard, and treated as valued members of Nebraska. Our motto is nothing about us without us. To find out what impact bills would have on the disabled community, any members can be contacted at the ADA Task Force, the League of Human Dignity, Independence Rising, the Statewide Independent Living Council, and many other places that have disabled people. Please correct this problem and show that our representatives consider all Nebraskans, not just the able-bodied ones. And I welcome any questions you have.
Thank you. Any questions for the testifier? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next proponent testifier, please. Welcome.
Welcome. Good afternoon, Senator Breezy, members of the committee or the board. For the record, my name is Brad, B-R-A-D, Meurrens, M-E-U-R-R-E-N-S, and I am the Public Policy Director at Disability Rights Nebraska. We are the designated protection and advocacy organization for persons with disabilities in Nebraska, and I'm here in strong support of LB 39. People with disabilities in Nebraska comprise around 11.2% of our state's population, and there are Nebraskans, like Kathy said, in every single county with disabilities. These are our family, our friends, our neighbors, and our community. And the state's major policymaking body must do its best to adequately and accurately evaluate how its choices will impact Nebraskans with disabilities and their families. Nebraskans with disabilities do face major disparities across a spectrum of measures, as the 2019 American Community Survey data indicate. They have a 22% poverty rate compared to 8% of those without disabilities. They're employed 30% percentage points lower than those without disabilities. And transportation options are severely limited for a variety of reasons. Housing stock's not accessible or affordable or safe. There's a broad or is simply unavailable. A conversation that I had many years ago with a legislative candidate encapsulates our support for this bill. Quote, "I'm glad you called, Brad. We have a person with a disability on our staff, and so does our opponent, but we have never thought about disability policy." So even when in plain sight, and I assume frequent interaction, the impact of policy decisions on Nebraskans with disabilities can be overlooked or ignored. Disability impact statements would provide the legislature a concrete reminder of the effect of policies it passes on this community and of its responsibility, both morally and legally, to best serve this community, especially considering that many Nebraskans with disabilities, through their disability, are more directly involved with and tied to public programs, resources, and services. The legislature has access to and authority to command resources, data, and information that is not available to the public or is difficult to obtain. These impact statements would provide the legislature with more data, which produces better policy. Plus, this data would help clarify or corroborate claims by people with disabilities, their families, and advocates. Furthermore, there are several examples in my testimony of these unintended consequences: the Medicaid buy-in program, and especially the Test Nebraska program. It had several unintended consequences that made the program inaccessible for persons with disabilities. Finally, we would suggest that people with disabilities, their families, advocates, and other pertinent organizations be involved in developing the selection criteria for legislation, as well as be consulted for input assessing the impact. The legislation calls for consultation with subject matter experts, and as Kathy had said, and I agree, people with disabilities are subject matter experts about living with their disability and the effects of public policy on their community. And as a result, we recommend advancing the bill. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier, welcome.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Reischer. It's spelled Peggy, Reischer, Reisher. And I'm the Executive Director for the Brain Injury Alliance of Nebraska. I'm here before you to testify in support of LB 39. I want to thank Senator Blood for introducing this. In the work that I do, I have the opportunity and time to spend advocating for individuals with disabilities that are often invisible to the general public. Those are disabilities that are caused by brain injury. Requiring an individual to, the best way I can think to illustrate the idea of to this committee today, I'd like to provide you with an example that you'll be considering later on in the session. Requiring individuals to have a driver's license or state identification card in order to vote is an example of a policy that would have a disproportionately negative impact on individuals with disabilities. A significant portion of individuals with disabilities do not drive, so they do not need to maintain a driver's license. The process of going to the DMV to obtain license or state ID may create physical and financial obstacles for that individual with disabilities that cannot be reasonably overcome. This is an example of a policy that may have unintended consequences, reducing the number of persons with disability to vote simply because they cannot obtain a driver's license. A disability impact statement would assist the legislature in making decisions about proposed policies, potentially eliminating any unintentional disparities before they occur. I'm certainly not naive enough to think we'd be able to eliminate all disparities for individuals with disabilities, but with diligence and intention, the Nebraska legislature can be an effective stewards of the basic principles of the public policy of do no harm. I appreciate your service and ask for a favorable consideration of LB 39. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that. Any questions of the testifier? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Any proponents are welcome to come up near the front rows here, so you're ready. Welcome.
Hello. Good afternoon, Chairman Breezy and members of the Executive Committee. My name is Rasna Sethi. That's RASNA SETHI, and I'm a policy analyst with Open Sky Policy Institute, here to support LB 39 because we believe it's important to consider the disparate impact general legislation has on the disability community. The disability community in Nebraska is made up of adults who are 75 years and older, about 50%. Based on data, the percentage of those with disability increases with age. Increasingly, while Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders only make up 0.1% of Nebraska's population, they have the highest rate of disability at 20% of their population. There is also a case for American Indians and Native Alaskans at 16.1% and Black African American Nebraskans at 13.1%. There are thus clear impacts on these populations, not only because of their disabilities, the disabilities they experience, but also their race and ethnicity. The manner in which state and local governments raise and spend revenue has major implications for all Nebraskans, including those experiencing disabilities and those who identify as non-white. Historically, fiscal policy has too often increased disparities in power, income, and wealth, and working to ensure fiscal policies provide equal opportunity for all people will help to promote economic prosperity across the state. We have identified several policy areas where the introduced impact statements for proposed legislation could be especially insightful. Changes in tax code, particularly those disproportionately impacting one end of the socioeconomic spectrum, can serve to exacerbate and temper disparities in both the ability and race and ethnicity. It is also important to examine how in certain budget areas could exacerbate inequalities within the state. Health, education, and transportation funding in particular areas are vital for shared prosperity, and health spending is critical for those Nebraskans experiencing disabilities, as our Medicaid and Medicare spending has direct impact on the care they receive. There are several resources that examine a number of different disparities, which Open Sky believes could aid in the development of impact statements for proposed legislation. The U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey tracks SNAP and school enrollment by race and ethnicity, as well as income and poverty status of families. The Kids Count Data Center disaggregates children at Title I schools by race and ethnicity at the state level. There is a growing trend in incorporating racial disparities in data collection, as demonstrated by the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention's Health Interview Survey. The data are certainly available to conduct through a thorough analysis of the racial impact for proposed legislation. With an increasing availability of all kinds of data, we strongly support and believe in doing everything possible to evaluate the impact of proposed legislations on our neighbors experiencing disability, and urge the committee to advance LB 39. With that, I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Welcome. Welcome.
My name is Mary Ann Williams, MarrianneWilliams, and I want to thank Senator Blood for bringing this. I wasn't sure if I could make it today, so I don't have anything prepared, but I just wanted to give you a few real-world examples of how this bill would affect me. I'm a low vision person due to an eye disease. On any given day, I may or may not be able to make out your facial features, for example. I mean, right today, you look like a bunch of blobs, but sometimes I can see things and sometimes I can't. So any legislation that, say, requires a notice to be given, for example, I may or may not be able to read that notice if it's not sent to me digitally. A digital copy allows me to blow it up in many, many ways. For example, the legislative site is difficult for me to maneuver. I've gotten really good at it just because I do it so much, but it is difficult. A PDF file for the actual bills, that makes it difficult for me to take that and to put it into a program to blow up the text, for example. Also, even just these forms. was a challenge for me today. I mean, I got it done, but I don't know if you'll be able to read it. But thank you. That's all I had today.
Well, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Williams? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Rose Godinez, spelled ROSCGODINEZ, and I'm testifying on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska in favor of LB 39. First, we'd like to thank Senator Blood for introducing this legislation and co-sponsors, which requires that disability impact statements be created for legislation, which specifically impacts Nebraskans with disabilities. The ACLU strives for a Nebraska free of discrimination against people with disabilities, where they are valued, integrated members of our society with full access to education, healthcare, homes, and voting, and beyond. Nebraska is home to over 218,000 Nebraskans with disabilities, yet nationally and in many cases in Nebraska, they're disproportionately overrepresented in students who are physically restrained, in jails, and in prison. For those reasons, the legislature should make informed decisions regarding the legislation potentially impacting Nebraskans with disabilities and advance LB 39 to general file. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Next proponent testifier, please. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Arlo Hettle, spelled ARLOHETTLE, and I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Coordinator at the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table. We're a member organization serving around 70 other nonpartisan nonprofit organizations across the state, and our mission is to ensure every community across the state has the opportunity to have a seat at the table and be involved in the policy decisions that affect their lives. We would like to offer our support for LB 39 and thank Senator Blood for working to make the legislative process more inclusive and highlight the disparate effects that legislation can have on those with disabilities. This bill provides an opportunity for legislatures to mitigate the unintended consequences that can occur when legislation is passed without considerations of its effects on people with disabilities. For example, much of the policy work the Nebraska Table does relates to bills on voting and other forms of civic participation. People with disabilities often face greater barriers in casting their votes, and it is important for policymakers to consider such barriers when writing legislation about electoral processes. If a voting bill were to require physical steps like going to a DMV or an election commissioner's office in person at some point in the process, someone with impaired mobility would be negatively affected by that policy choice. One hurdle to civic participation as a whole is people feeling that their government does not fully represent them. This can include being at the receiving end of negative unintended consequences of policy decisions. If we want to increase the civic health of our state and ensure participation from voices that have historically been left out of the conversation, we need to start by showing a commitment to undoing some of the damage that has been done from previous legislation. A great way to do that is devoting more of our resources to researching the potential disparate impacts that bills could have. The table would support including people with disabilities in those discussions and decision-making processes whenever possible. As Nebraskans, we believe deeply in fairness for all people. By making the effort to study the impact of proposed legislation on the thousands of Nebraskans with some form of disability, policymakers have an opportunity to advance fairness and reduce harm. For those reasons, we ask you to support LB 39. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier, please. Go ahead. Yeah. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Corinne Meadows, the Executive Director for NAMI Nebraska. It's Corinne, C-A-R-R-I-N. My last name is Meadows, M-E-A-D-O-W-S.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Senator Blood for bringing this to our attention. Dear Senator Brees and the members of the Executive Committee, on behalf of the National Alliance of Mental Illness Nebraska, I want to thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony to you today and add our support of LB 39 as part of the public record. The Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990 includes psychiatric disabilities in its coverage and its definition of disabilities. The purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act is to make sure that all people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. The Americans with Disabilities Act guarantees equal opportunity for individuals and disabilities in public accommodations, employment, transportation, state and local government services. and telecommunications. Mental illness and disability go hand in hand. The reality is that you cannot see mental illness. So many times mental illness is swept under the rug as it did not even exist. Mental illness can have significant negative effects on an individual's ability to function in society. A key statistic to this negative effect is the unemployment rate is higher among U.S. adults with mental illness. Depression is a leading cause of disability worldwide. There are many more statistics to justify how psychiatric disabilities pose a significant negative effect on individuals' ability to function. First, mental illness causes $193.2 billion in lost earnings each year in the U.S. Second, 20.8% of people experiencing homelessness in the U.S. have a serious mental health condition. Third, 37% of incarcerated adults in the prison system have a diagnosed mental illness. And in an alarming statistic, in high school students with significant symptoms of depression are more than twice as likely to drop out. Our state and our country are in a mental health crisis, which affects not only just healthcare, but people's livelihoods and overall quality of life. We cannot afford to allow this crisis to get even worse. LB 39 would help to ensure that legislation does not have unintended harmful impacts on people suffering from psychiatric disability. NAMI Nebraska supports LB 39 to provide disability impact statements for legislation and to provide powers of duties for the Office of Legislative Research. I urge the committee to vote in favor of LB 39 by providing this opportunity, as we are Nebraskans are hoping those with psychiatric disabilities to be heard and to begin to eliminate the stigma surrounding mental illness. LB 39 is an important step forward for the citizens of Nebraska. We respectfully ask that you support LB 39 and all legislation that helps those whose lives are impacted by mental illness. Thank you for the service to the state of Nebraska.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Welcome.
Welcome, Chair. Thank you, Chairman Breezy, for the committee. Members of the committee. My name is Josephine Litwinowitz, JOSEPHINELITWINOWICZ. And basically what I wanted to say, and I don't know if somebody's already said it, but part of this, I believe there's a committee of some sort where there's people that decide, about the impact statement, the financial aspect. Well, I noticed that it didn't explicitly say someone or some people with disabilities. And I say that because different disabilities may have different impact statements. And I know that the different kinds of disabilities were all unique, and they really, in a physical space and maybe in a mental space, it makes a difference. And so without getting that input as far as, well, I was kind of annoyed, not just to see it, just to not see it, but it's actually essential. And so also, disability, probably, I don't know, but definitely disability can be associated with forms of mental illness. And, I suffer from mental illness, and which is part of the reason why I became homeless once. And then it was a miracle through Lutheran Family Services that I found a place. And so with that, I think my disability suffers from me, though. I think I'm a little bigger. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next proponent testifier.
Good afternoon, Chair Reese and members of the Executive Board.
Welcome.
I'll be brief. You've got a copy of my statement, so I'm not going to read it to you. I'm having that distributed. My name is Spike Eicholt, S-P-I-K-E. Last name is E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T. I'm appearing on behalf of Voices for Children in Nebraska. You've got a copy of my statement, so I won't read it. I'm also having distributed a summary, a report from Health and Human Services on the demographics of disability and the disabled in Nebraska. Kind of give you an idea. We are here in support of this bill. To kind of summarize, Voices for Children works with and on behalf of children who are on the child welfare system and juvenile justice system, and a significant number of children who are in both of those child welfare system and juvenile justice system are disabled, whether it's a learning disability, a sensory disability, or some similar recognized disability. This bill is a very good bill, and we want to thank Senator Flood for introducing it. I would just ask the committee to consider that this does not require a disability statement be done or prepared in every bill. It's as directed by the executive board on page 2, lines 22 to 23, as designated by the executive board, a disability impact statement may be prepared. So that's a good nuanced approach. And I would respectfully suggest that this committee and this body could adopt that. And I can give an example because as Speaker Arch and Senator Bosa can attest, the Rules Committee already did a similar, perhaps smaller version of what a disability impact statement envisions. We had a number of rule proposals this year. There was a series of rule requests that allowed for remote testimony to be reflected on the committee statement. That rule was not fully amended, but an accommodation was made to allow for ADA accommodation of written testimony that could be submitted online for people who simply could not be here very easily, and that could still be noted on the committee statement that they submitted testimony in the official record. So I just want to point that out, that this can be done. And we want to thank Senator Bullock for introducing this bill, and I'll answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier, please. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Breezy. My name is Dunixi Gureca. That's D-U-N-I-X-I, last name G-U-E-R-E-C-A. I am the Executive Director of Stand for Schools, an organization that advances public education here in Nebraska. I had a scoutmaster that once told me brevity is a virtue. As such, I will not be reading my testimony. However, we are here in support of this bill. Our great public schools serve a lot of kids with disabilities. So we should know what that impact is on them. Thank you so much.
Very, very good. Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Any other proponent testifiers? Welcome.
Hello. Hi, my name is Edison McDonald, E-D-I-S-O-N, M-C-D-O-N-A-L-D, representing the ARC of Nebraska. We advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. You've already heard about the ethics and the importance of accessibility. I want to talk about a couple of other pieces. I think one of the things that I've really realized in this work is how many things we don't realize, we don't think about impact the accessibility of a building. We don't think about doors and not being able to grab them because we don't have full mobility in our hands and being able to twist and open a door. We don't think about what happens if we were to get a raise and say we got a couple $1 an hour raise and then would lose $60,000 a year in Medicaid coverage that helps to keep us alive. We don't think about what it looks like if we have to go and say, are we going to send our kid to foster care? Are we going to get divorced? Or is our kid going to die because they can't get access to the medical coverage that they need? These are the conversations that I have to have with our members all the time. And it's a whole different reality than many of us are used to dealing with. I think the second thing to really think about is really making sure that we are trying to prevent potential litigation. Earlier, they talked about the Nebraska State Olmstead Plan that was in reaction to a Supreme Court case that requires every state to have a plan to ensure that people have access within the state. Well, right now we have the Department of Justice in the state investigating Nebraska, looking at housing, looking at HHS, looking at transportation, looking across the spectrum. And frankly, I think that like states like Washington, the likelihood that we may end up in a consent decree where we're forced to go and take a lot of actions that are going to have significant costs is pretty high. So we need to go and proceed with these disability impact statements to make sure that we're thinking through what that means and how that could impact us in terms of litigation and financial responsibility. And lastly, I just want to say, Nebraska has been a leader in the disability arena since the start of the deinstitutionalization movement. We had amazing folks who really led the charge. This is an opportunity for Nebraska to be a leader in the disability world again. So I hope that you'll support this bill. Thank you. Any questions?
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Any other proponent testifiers? I see none. We do have ADA written accommodation testimony from Don Drew and Mary Angus. With that, do we have any opposition testifiers? Seeing none, any neutral testifiers? Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Breezy, members of the Executive Board. My name is Benjamin Thompson. It's BenjaminThompson. I am your Director of Research. I lead the Legislative Research Office, which would be tasked with preparing the impact statements under LB 39. Our office is charged with providing nonpartisan public policy and legal research to all the senators and the staff in the building, or in the legislature rather, and we would be happy to provide any additional assistance that's requested of us, any additional data that would help you provide meaningful or have meaningful debate, appropriate legislation, and ensure that there's no unintended or at least unanticipated consequences. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Do you have any idea what would this impose any sort of a burden on your office, or what the cost would be to facilitate this?
Well, it's hard to predict without knowing how many bills are going to be included, but I would say that, well, first of all, we do have a line item for contracting with outside subject matter experts, if that is appropriate. The current staffing may or may not be adequate depending on the volume of them. I will say though that our office, all of our research analysts are at the Research Analyst 1 classification. And I anticipate that moving some or all of them to Research Analyst 2 would probably be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Any other neutral testimony? Seeing none, with that, Senator Blood, you're welcome to close. We do have a handful of written position comments, 8 proponents and 5 opponents. Welcome back, Senator Blood.
Thank you, Chair Breezy. I'll be as brief as I possibly can because I know you have one more bill. I want to first address the opposition because I did read those prior to the hearing. And the theme is always government overreach, don't put money into bigger government. We're actually doing the opposite of that. I think it's really important. You see your fiscal notes. You've heard Ben from LRO. We're not creating bigger government. We're not expanding the government. We're not pumping millions of dollars into something. What we're doing is utilizing an existing source whose daily task is research. So the other thing I want to point out is that continually throughout today's hearing, I heard the same words over and over again. Invisible, we want consideration, and disparities. And when I hear those 3 words, only one word comes to mind, and that is disenfranchised. I've been working off and on with the disability community for at least 2 decades. Kathy and I go way back when she was like 16. And what I know is that our efforts are just when we move forward bills that we try to do no harm, but that doesn't always happen. And none of us are subject matter experts in this room as far as senators go. We have to depend on others when we come upon a hurdle to make sure that we do no harm. You do not have to send every bill to LRO. It's your discretion. There'll be a process put into place by LRO to make sure that it is a streamlined process. But it does need to be done. If you watch people come in and out of this room and testify, you saw just the few hurdles they had to have or that they came upon when they came to testify. Moving things out of the way, people literally having to physically get out of the way so people could come in and out and do what that they're allowed to do as our second house. Now, think about the statewide, broader. Think of all the legislation we've passed. Again, you've heard it today, affordable housing. When we talked about affordable housing, how many times do we talk about people with disabilities? Right? When we talk about students, unless it's a topic that's specific to children with disabilities, we don't always think about all of our students and those with disabilities. So we have an opportunity to be a leader with really a very small process to get us to that place. And then we can start addressing all Nebraskans. And that's one thing that I also want to leave you with today. Have you noticed how I use first person language, where I put the person before the disability? That's something that's lacking in our own state statute. We say disabled veterans, not veterans with disabilities. We say the word blind before who the person is. It's always the person first, disability second. So if I leave you with anything today, I ask that you participate in that language because it's out of respect to Nebraskans with disabilities that we have to do that. And so with that, I think that you've heard a comprehensive idea of what this is about. We have a lot of positive facts behind moving forward on this. And I hope that you do make us a leader because, friends, once we start this, it's going to be more of a movement. And we're always last to the table. Come on. We won't be very first, but we'll be the top 10.
Okay, thank you, Senator Blood. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for your patience today.
And that will close the hearing on LB 39, and we will open the hearing on LB 54. We may have some senators that will have to leave as we get closer to 1:30, but my staff and I will remain as long as we need to. So with that, welcome Senator McKinney.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Breezy and fellow members of the Executive Board. My name is Terrell McKinney, Terrell McKinney, and I represent the 11th Legislative District up in Omaha. I am honored to bring LB 54, a bill to require the Office of Legislative Research to prepare racial impact statements for legislative bills before you today. This bill acknowledges that racial impact statements are a tool for lawmakers to evaluate potential disparities of proposed legislation prior to adoption and implementation. They are similar to fiscal impact statements in that they assist legislators in detecting unforeseen policy ramifications as they pertain to racial disparities within our state. This gives legislators the opportunity to amend their proposed bills to alleviate or even eliminate potential harm. The Nebraska state seal states equality before the law. What better way to ensure this than the implementation of racial impact statements, an integral tool that ensures that systematic racism in the justice and policy-making process remains subdued. It is paramount that we keep all Nebraskans in mind while implementing legislation that would apply to people of the state, especially some of its most vulnerable who are most susceptible to negative outcomes of legislation that isn't equitable nor written with the intent of lessening the disparities between people of different races or ethnicities. Under this bill, every legislative bill that relates to the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, prisons, jails, probation, or parole, and that if passed, may have a disparate impact on racial minority populations, must be accompanied by a statement pursuant to that impact. Every bill that passes through our legislative process should have racial impact statements attached. However, the decision to limit the focus to criminal justice came from my realization that in a state with an overcrowding crisis, a more centralized application would improve, hopefully, the conditions of Nebraska's criminal justice system. It is not breaking news relative to the greater Nebraska state population that Black, Hispanic, and Native American individuals are overrepresented in our child welfare system, juvenile justice system, and the Nebraska Department of Correction admissions. In a report released by the Sentencing Project, it stated that in Nebraska, Black residents are incarcerated at a rate nearly 9 times of that of white residents, and Hispanic and Latino residents are in prison at double the rate of white residents. Racial impact statements are a tool for us to evaluate potential impacts on these disparities prior to the adoption, and allows us to rectify them before they cause any additional harm. This bill will also have additional benefits to taxpayers. The Omaha World Herald released an article titled "Paying the Price," explaining that laws passed in Nebraska that heightened penalties on certain offenses and steered hundreds of incarcerated individuals from federal prisons into the state system, adding a tab for Nebraskan taxpayers while also increasing the disproportionate representation of Black, Hispanic, and Native American individuals, especially those that are from zip codes in my district. My thinking is that implementing a system in which these types of impacts can be evaluated before bills are passed can help us alleviate even the most minuscule of consequences. In passing this bill, the state of Nebraska would also be in good company. 9 states, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Maine, Maryland, New Jersey, Oregon, Virginia, and our neighboring state of Iowa have already implemented mechanisms for the preparation and consideration of racial impact statements. We cannot shy away from the conversation because it's deemed uncomfortable. What should be uncomfortable is that we champion our state as the good life state, but we have in the past and currently continue to push forward legislation that will have negative effects on minority populations in our state. We must ensure that we pass legislation with all Nebraskans in mind. It is clear that without racial impact statements, we will continue as a state to introduce and potentially pass legislation that continues to perpetuate systematic harm. I encourage you all to move this bill forward and onto the floor to move our state in a better place. And I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Any questions for Senator McKinney? Seeing none, thank you very much. First proponent testifier. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Senator Breezy and members of the Executive Board. My name is Jasmine Harris, JASMINEHARRIS. I am the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at RISE, and I request that you all put this in testimony that RISE supports LB 54. RISE is the largest nonprofit organization in Nebraska focused solely on habilitative programming in prisons and reentry support. Our overall mission is to break generational cycles of incarceration. We want to thank Senator McKinney for introducing this legislation and Senator Vargas for introducing it in previous sessions. The idea of racial impact statements may make some feel uncomfortable and bring about thoughts of divisiveness, but this type of analysis tool is one that can actually help with increasing equity across our states in regards to the legislation and policies that are introduced, but specifically those that deal with the criminal and juvenile justice systems. At RISE, we see the racial disparities in Nebraska's criminal justice system on a daily basis. With over 600 individuals that have graduated from our program that we offer in the state's correctional facilities, we are able to see the trends that data specialists have presented on paper. Last year, the legislature was presented information in regards to the data about Nebraska's criminal justice system from the Crime and Justice Institute. And one thing that was made very clear is that there is a disproportionate representation of people in color in our state facilities. African Americans at 22%, Hispanic 13%, and Native American 6% respectively. Those numbers may seem low, but when you look at the amount of individuals that those populations are in our state, which is 4%, 9%, and 1% respectively, that shows a very disproportionate amount of people that are in our systems. These racial impact statements were first introduced and passed by our neighboring state of Iowa, as Senator McKinney said, back in 2008. Colorado and Minnesota also use these type of statements. And I talk about these three states because we always talk about the states on the coast, and Nebraska is not like the states on the coast. So I think if we can be like our neighboring states, we can find a way to use these kind of tools. Since using the racial impact statements in Iowa, the rate of incarceration of Black Iowans has dropped from 13.6 times more likely to be incarcerated than the white Iowans, down to 9-1. And this was due to the statements informing legislators how the drug sentencing proposals would impact Black Iowans. What I've handed out to you is a fiscal note from the Legislative Services Agency that serves Iowa Legislature. And if you turn to page 3, it talks about the correctional impact and the minority impact at the bottom. And one of the things that I want to pull to note is the last sentence where it says, to the extent the bill shifts serious misdemeanor convictions to aggravated misdemeanor convictions, there will be an increase in the length of stay of minority offenders in the corrections system. And this bill that they had this attached to was broadening a definition of eluding or attempting to elude a marked law enforcement vehicle. So just showing what kind of impact that can be presented in this statement. So knowing that we have an overrepresentation of people of color in our criminal justice system, seeing the devastating outcomes that incarceration has had on many families because of generational cycles of incarceration, the unintended consequences that follow a person after incarceration, and the impact this has on communities across our state, it is imperative that we begin to look at how people of color are impacted by the legislation in Nebraska, specifically around the criminal and juvenile justice systems. I do want to point out, contrary to belief, people of color do not commit more crimes than other groups. It is a result of over-policing in communities that create more contact. So therefore, it seems like there are more people who commit more crimes. For these reasons, RISE supports LB 54 and asks that committee members vote this bill out of committee to general file. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Shea Orduna, spelled Cheorduna, and I am here speaking on behalf of Heartland Family Service in support of Senator McKinney's LB 54 for racial impact statements. Racial impact statements are an important tool for our state to evaluate potential disparities of proposed legislation prior to adopting and implementation. While Senator McKinney highlighted that people of color are disproportionately overrepresented in every stage of the criminal justice system, racial impact statements would also be helpful in considering bills related to education, housing, changes in a tax policy, and more. Similar to fiscal impact statements, they assist in detecting unforeseen policy ramifications so that we may be able to modify legislation that would worsen existing racial disparities. Practically speaking, it is important to address policies' unwarranted effects before it is adopted. As senators, we, the people of Nebraska, extend trust by way of giving our votes. Through our votes, we also extend faith in the promise to maintain high ethical standards, which include denouncing any bill that supports the perpetuation of racism. By passing LB 54, we would make a monumental impact on healing racial wounds throughout our state. Voting for LB 54 offers each lawmaker, present and future, the full capacity of being champions supporting racial equity for citizens of Nebraska. Please vote yes for LB 54.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Welcome.
Thank you. Again, I don't have anything prepared. My name is Mary Ann Williams, MARRIANNE, WILLIAMS. I just want to give another real world example. In just a little bit, I'll be testifying at a bill for Senator Sanders on the Asian American Commission. And while I fully support that commission, I do have concerns as a Samoan. Pacific Islanders are not included in that bill. We are always lumped together as a group, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. So to me, my concern is what is my chances of coming to you, one of you later, and saying, we need representation, and you thinking we already have it because there's an Asian American Commission. It's very possible that Senator Sanders doesn't like us all being lumped together either, but I do. That's just one way out my people could be disenfranchised by that bill. And that's all I have today.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier, please. Welcome again.
Hi. My name is Rasna Sethi. That's RASNA SETHI, and I'm the policy analyst at Open Sky Policy Institute. And to keep my testimony brief, we support this bill for the same reasons as the disability impact statements, in that we believe in disaggregated data and being able to be transparent. One thing I will mention in this bill is that it is important to recognize the economic impacts that criminal justice, that the criminal justice system has on families. It was reported that at least one member, studies show that a family that has at least one imprisoned member faces a sharp drop in household income, and nearly 2 in 3 families who have an incarcerated member report not being able to meet their family's basic needs. And with that, I'll thank you. If there are any questions, please let me know.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Anybody that's going to testify, feel free to come up to the front rows. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Breezy and members of the Executive Board. My name is Kimora Snipes. It's KIMARASNIPES. I am the Director of Equity and Community Partnerships for the Nebraska Civic Engagement Table, where we invite and encourage people from every community in Nebraska to have a seat at the table where decisions are made that affect their lives. Part of my role is to make sure that we do our work as we are do our work and apply an equity-holistic approach to every decision that we make. I want to thank Senator McKinney for introducing LB 54 that really gets to the heart of promoting a legislative process that ensures that no community in Nebraska is left behind. I spoke recently at a rules hearing regarding racial impact statements. As a Black woman who researches and practices intellectual curiosity, I left with a range of emotions, one of them being concern. I encourage you to read the transcripts. My concern is that the thought process displayed that day are the thought processes that feed into policymaking decisions here in Nebraska. That discussion served as a reminder of why legislators need to prioritize centering fairness in their policymaking by having access to important information regarding legislative impacts on underrepresented communities, like the one that I come from. Legislation has historically impacted and harmed racial minority communities differently than white communities, especially through the criminal and juvenile justice systems, and any bit of research will show you that. Interaction with the criminal and juvenile justice systems disproportionately harms people of color, including through eligibility and ability to participate in civic life. For example, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color comprise 22% of the state population, yet make up only 8% of the voting population. System involvement creates barriers to civic engagement and democratic participation, including through legislation that overtly strips people of their voting rights. As someone who travels across Nebraska, I recognize how we all want to live in the best possible state. At the same time, so many of us are vividly unaware of what disparities are or how they exist. And we all have our own biases that we need to challenge with facts and data. In order to adequately address any existing gaps or disparities, it is absolutely necessary to be intentional and equity-lacic when reviewing policy. As Nebraskans, we believe deeply in fairness for all people by making this effort for policymakers having an opportunity to advance fairness and reduce harm. For these reasons, we seek your support of this bill. Thank you for your service to our state.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next proponent testifier, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Spike Eicholt, S-P-I-K-E. Last name is E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T. I'm appearing on behalf of Voices for Children of Nebraska, the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorneys Association, and Nebraskans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. I hope it's okay if I just do all that at once and save you time.
Perfect.
You're receiving a copy of my statement that I'm submitting on behalf of Voices for Children, so I won't read that. And I think the committee has an idea, at least conceptually, what Senator McKinney is proposing. And again, I want to thank Senator McKinney for introducing it and Senator Vargas for introducing this concept a few years ago. I would just like to point out, in addition to my statement, you're also receiving a copy of a report from the Sentencing Project, which summarizes the 9 states that have this concept already in law. And I think Senator McKinney mentioned earlier that Iowa has had this, I think, for the longest. And Colorado, one of our other neighboring states, also has this concept when they consider legislation. So I think respectfully, this legislature could do it as well. Similar to LB 39, LB 54 on page 3, lines 3 and 4 provide that a racial impact statement shall only be prepared as designated by the executive board. So it's not for every bill. It's not at the request of the introducer or even the committee. If the racial impact statement is prepared, it's designated by the executive board of the legislative council. So there can be some, perhaps, small efforts on this front, and we can to see how it goes starting next session. I'll answer any questions you have, but I don't want to be repetitive of what other people have said. And I know that many of you have to be at another hearing at 1:30.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Karen Beldancy, KarenBellDancy, and I serve as the Executive Director of the YWCA of Lincoln. Our mission with the YWCA of Lincoln is the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women. We have had the pleasure of being in the Lincoln community now almost 140 years. So you can imagine over the decades, the work and the impact that we have had working with our community, working toward peace, equality, and justice and freedom for all. Like many of my colleagues before me, I will not read my complete formal statement. We have passed that statement out, but I do want to emphasize a couple of points that we see that are essential to the framework of the work that we do. I came in late into this hearing because I just left a training that we are engaged in with the GARE professionals. GARE is the Government Alliance for Racial Equity. And here in our community, it consists of those professionals that work for our government throughout the city and at the county level. We have been involved in training this group since July of last year, and we will continue until the end of June this year. Our topic is addressing racial and ethnic disparities. We know that they exist, and we're working to help to develop those kinds of conversations and giving the tools and resources to our government professionals here in our community. So as they work with clients, with teams, with each other, and interdepartmentally. This bill is very important for the work that we do. We support this bill because we know that these disparities exist, and they exist in starting with children as they are young as 5, and it goes on throughout life. These disparities are important for us to recognize, and we must address that. As I conclude my comments, I would like to offer up the resources that we have as the YWCA of Lincoln in identifying and working with racial disparities. The stories that we hear and the narrative that is presented to us amounts to how the average citizen, how they view things here in Lincoln, Nebraska. And until we have the legislation in place that addresses these kinds of things, it will continue to hamper those that cannot have that freedom and justice and equality. And that's what motivates our work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you for your time.
Next proponent testifier. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello again. My name is Rose Galinas, spelled ROSEGODINEC, and I'm testifying on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska in favor of LB 54. We'd first like to thank Senator McKinney and Senator Conrad for introducing LB 54, which requires that racial impact statements be created for legislation related to the criminal justice system. If advanced, LB 54 signals a strong commitment from you all at the Nebraska Legislature to racial equity in the legislative process, and in turn to live up to the state motto of equality before the law. Unfortunately, as much as other advocates and I repeat and repeat that certain groups are disproportionately impacted or overrepresented in hearing testimony, we are unable to ensure that the statement is received by all senators, is understood, is heard, or is considered. Whereas racial impact statements represent a significant tool already attached to a bill, allowing you to determine whether a proposed bill may have an adverse impact on people of color before it becomes law. This is important because while legislative bills may be racially neutral on its face, they can perpetuate racial disparities. And while racial impact statements do not end racism, again, I think this is a firm commitment to racial equity in the legislative process. And for those reasons, we urge you to advance this bill to general file.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier, please. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairperson Breezy and committee members. My name is Ruby Mendez Lopez, spelled RUBY-MENDEZ-LOPEZ, and I work with Nebraska Appleseed, a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to justice and opportunity for all Nebraskans. Today, we are here to testify in strong support of LB 54, which would require racial impact statements for bills designated by the executive board and with a focus on bills relating to criminal justice, the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, prisons, jails, probation, and parole. Good government is responsible government. Every bill considered by the Nebraska legislature is already required to include a fiscal note. The attached fiscal note allows policymakers and community members alike to evaluate the fiscal impact of a proposed bill before it becomes law. This is viewed as a crucial part of the legislative process that allows consideration of the merits, drawbacks, or unintended consequences of a bill's fiscal impact. Like fiscal notes, racial impact statements require an explanation of the expected impact of a legislative proposal on the communities of color. This is an important tool for the lawmaking process. Many people think of racial discrimination on an individual level, rooted in individual beliefs and intent. This is interpersonal racism, but what we're talking about here is racial disparities that come from our shared and inherited history. History that has resulted in inequality and exclusion in our institutions and society. As just one example, the GI Bill offered free college and low-cost home loans to veterans after World War II. But redlining practices meant some veterans could buy homes only in poorer parts of town where property was worth less or couldn't access loans at all because of the color of their skin. The effects of past discriminatory policies and the racial residential segregation they created continue into the present and continue impacting communities today. We can see this in racially segregated communities of color experiencing more obstacles to homeownership, starting or expanding businesses, accumulating wealth, financing a college education, and generating property tax revenues to fund schools. This is just one example of structural racism, which does not rely on individual beliefs or intent. And these racial inequalities will continue unless we work together and make intentional choices to change it. Past history is not our fault, but it is our opportunity and responsibility to understand and fix it together to prevent future disparities and harm. For these reasons, we urge the committee to adopt LB 54 to require the inclusion of racial impact statements as a part of our legislative process. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Next proponent testifier. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Breezy, Senator McKinney, members of the Executive Board. Stanford Schools is a nonprofit dedicated to advancing public education here in Nebraska. I'm Denixi Goretka, that's DUNIXI GUERECA, the organization's executive director. Stanford School supports LB 54. As a first-generation Mexican-American, I know the impact the legislation can have on minority communities. And often these impacts, well, they're unintended consequences of legislation. It's our firm belief that smart and sound policy solutions have proved that they are just that, both smart and sound. Senator McKinney and LB 54 is proposing a way to obtain that proof. It is crucial for policymakers, government agencies, and NGOs like ours, and for the public to know the implications of our decisions. If we're serious in our efforts to eliminate the opportunity gap in our schools and to address the racial disparities that exist in our criminal justice system in housing, health, and wealth, we must know what works and what doesn't. We urge you to support LB 54. We will further urge you to consider expanding the scope to include any legislation, if passed, that may have a disparate impact on Nebraskans of color. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the safe and soundest thing to do. Thank you. And for those reasons, we support LB 54, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for testimony.
Thank you.
Next proponent testifier. Seeing none, any opponent testimony? Seeing none, any neutral testimony? Welcome.
Hello again. Benjamin Thompson, BenjaminThomson. And I'm your Director of Research, head of the Legislative Research Office, which would be tasked with preparing the racial impact statements. I'm here testifying in a neutral capacity on LB 54. To follow up on what was just mentioned there, I wanted to point out that in the time that these bills have been considered, Colorado passed a law in 2019 that requires demographic notes. And so as I think about the logistics, the methodology on how to approach this, I just wanted to read from the memo that the Legislative Council staff in Colorado put out at the end of 2019. It says, a demographic note uses available data to outline the potential effects of proposed legislation on existing disparities within the state. Disparities are defined in state law as a difference in economic, employment, health, education, or public safety outcomes between the state population as a whole and subgroups of the population as defined by socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, geography, or any other relevant characteristic for which data are available. So as you consider this, if it's a direction you want to go in, maybe this is a plan C that can kind of merge everything together and approach it a little more comprehensively. But if that is the case or the direction that you want to go, we would probably want to hire a demographer to make sure that that gets done well and that we can continue performing all the other functions that we perform. Any questions?
Any questions?
I do just have a really quick question. So is that a scientific method of how to acquire that information? I mean, or is it subjective?
A demographer is someone who studies the human population and all its characteristics, so I would consider it a science.
Scientific, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Geist. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Seeing no other questions, thank you very much for your testimony. Any other neutral testifiers? Seeing none, Senator McKinney, you're welcome to close. We have written position statements from 14 proponents and 8 opponents. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, members of the executive board, for sitting here through this, and thank you to everyone that came to testify today. I would say I hope that through this hearing, you see why it's important that we look at legislation through a holistic perspective, especially bills that deal with criminal justice, juvenile justice, prisons, parole, and anything of the sort. I think it's important because we have these disparities, and I don't think unless we hit them head first, we'll ever get beyond those disparities in our state. And, you know, we could say we have a great state, but we also have to identify that we have areas of improvement. And I think a big area of improvement is decreasing the amount of disparities inside of our criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Senator McKinney? Seeing none, thank you for being here today and bringing this.
Thank you.
And that will close the hearing on LB 54. And the hearings for